Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
The Gleiwitz Incident. This year, I've taken an in-depth look at the Eastern Front in all of its gruesome glory, focusing in particular on the human drama and the bloody nature of the battles which took place during the final weeks of the Second World War. However, as we come to the end of 2025, I thought it would be nice to switch things up a little and give you a bonus episode focusing on events which took place at the outbreak of the war, namely the series of false flag attacks which were carried out by the Nazis along the German-Polish border in late August 1939. It's my hope that the story of this false flag operation and the somewhat farcical way in which events played out will give you something to chuckle about as you're sipping a hot cup of Glühwein this Christmas. As always, I've created a Google map to help you follow along with the story. You can find this in the show notes. So it's time to travel back to the summer of 1939 and hear how the SS attempted to kick off the Second World War in style. By the summer of 1939, the storm clouds of war had well and truly gathered over Europe. Tensions were at boiling point, armies were on full alert, and all diplomatic efforts to avoid a war seemed to have failed. Everyone held their breath, awaiting, or rather dreading, the single spark that would ignite another devastating conflict across the continent. But whilst war was close, in many ways, it had been a long time coming. Since Adolf Hitler had come to power in 1933, he had been hell-bent on overturning the perceived injustices which he felt Germany suffered as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And none of those injustices enraged Hitler more than the territorial losses inflicted upon Germany by the treaty. After the First World War, Germany had been stripped of 13% of its territory and roughly 10% of its population, with the largest loss of land and people coming in the east. Here, a huge swathe of Germany's pre-war domains now formed an integral part of Poland. And this so-called Polish corridor separated Germany proper from the exclave of East Prussia. These losses were a bitter pill for Germans to swallow, and it's no surprise that Hitler found widespread support for his campaign to reclaim these territories. In 1936, Wehrmacht forces marched into the Rhineland, in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1938, Austria was successfully annexed into the German Reich, and later that year, the German-speaking Sudetenland was also awarded to Germany following the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference was a desperate last-ditch attempt by the British and the French to avoid war with Germany, and they hoped that Hitler's incessant demands for territory were now finally fulfilled. But despite the promises made by Hitler at the conference, in March 1939, German forces simply marched into the rest of the Czech lands, forcibly incorporating them into the new German protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. By now, it was clear to all, Hitler would stop at nothing in his dream of establishing Lebensraum for the German people, and his promises of sticking to diplomatic means only in order to grow Germany's territory weren't worth the paper they were written on. But after seizing Prague, the question was, where would the Wehrmacht march next? The answer was Poland. In 1934, Poland had signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazi German government. This pact was a diplomatic coup for the Nazis, as it concealed their long-term goal of seizing Lebensraum to the east, and it helped gain them international recognition. It also bought the Nazis time to rebuild the German military machine. But this pact with Poland was only ever going to last so long. Following the Munich conference in November 1938, Nazi Germany started placing increasing diplomatic pressure on Poland with a series of outrageous demands. These demands were deliberately calculated to torpedo the non-aggression pact between the two countries. German diplomats demanded the following: that Poland return control of the free city of Danzig to Germany, that Poland consent to Germany building road and rail links through the Polish corridor to connect Germany with East Prussia, and lastly, the final demand was that Poland support the global anti-communist cause by joining the German-led Anti-Comintern Pact. To say these demands were controversial is an understatement. There was simply no way Poland could consent to these proposals, as to do so would have meant sacrificing Poland's access to the Baltic Sea, whilst at the same time compromising its strategic neutrality between Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. Unsurprisingly, Poland rejected these demands, issuing a formal rebuttal on the 25th of March, 1939. Desperately seeking allies in the face of German hostility, Poland signed the Anglo-Polish alliance with Britain on the 31st of March. An infuriated Hitler responded by formally nullifying the 1934 non-aggression pact with Poland. Germany and Poland mobilized their forces, and soon 1.5 million Polish and 2.5 million German soldiers were facing off against each other along their shared border. Both nations were on a path to war. But who would strike first? Hitler was obviously crazy, but even he knew that there were limits to Germany's military might. So in the summer of 1939, he was laser-focused on finding ways at improving Germany's chances of success when the inevitable conflict with Poland came. On the diplomatic front, Hitler instructed his foreign minister Ribbentrop to conduct secret negotiations with the Soviets. This was to ensure that when Germany invaded Poland, the Soviets would not come to Poland's rescue. In time, a non-aggression pact between the Nazis and the Soviets would be signed, and the fact that this pact also contained a secret protocol giving the Soviet Union a green light to invade Poland from the east was just the icing on the cake. However, as incredible as this diplomatic success was for the Nazis, there still remained the question of what Britain and France might do once Germany launched its invasion of Poland. The German leadership did not relish the thought of fighting a war on two fronts, just as they had done during the First World War. So to lessen the risk that Britain and France would declare war on Germany as a result of its invasion of Poland, Hitler concluded that he needed to manufacture the appearance that Poland, not Germany, was the aggressor. And if he could present Germany as the victim of Polish hostility, This might even convince the Western Allies not to intervene on Poland's behalf. Therefore, Hitler ordered that a series of false flag attacks be carried out along the German-Polish border. And it was crucial that these attacks be high-profile and destructive enough to convince the British and the French that Germany was innocent in the face of Polish aggression. Usually, false flag-style operations would have fallen under the remit of the military intelligence service, the Abwehr. But given Hitler's obsession with the plan and the utmost need for secrecy and success, Hitler ordered the SS, under Heinrich Himmler, to orchestrate the false flag attacks instead. Himmler, in turn, passed on this assignment to Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Sicherheitspolizei and the Sicherheitsdienst, which was the SS intelligence service known as the SD. Just a heads up from my side, different historians refer to the false flag attacks which took place in 1939 with different operational names. Some call the operation Operation Tannenberg, whilst others call it Operation Himmler. It seems that this confusion stems from the lack of authoritative works on the subject. I'm going to play it safe and will just refer to the incidents as false flag attacks or the false flag operation. I hope that makes sense. Heydrich moved quickly, and he assigned a group of officers to carry out the mission. They were SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Hellwig, SS Standartenführer Hans Trümmler, and the SS Oberführers Otto Rasch, Herbert Mellhorn, and Heinrich Müller. On the 8th of August, Heydrich and the officers held their first meeting, and at this meeting it was decided that hundreds of men would be required for the false flag operation, so that multiple false flag attacks could be carried out at different locations, in order to create the illusion of a sizable Polish military incursion. The key criteria for the men who would carry out these attacks was that they must be military trained and fluent in Polish. To secure the right type of men, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Hellwig searched amongst SS units stationed in the district of Silesia, which was close to the Polish border. Silesia has a long history of mixed German and Polish language and culture. Thus, it was the perfect place to find the ideal recruits who could play act as Polish saboteurs. Whilst Hellwig searched for recruits, Heydrich concentrated on choosing suitable sites for the series of false flag attacks. The locations needed to be high profile, yet far enough from major Polish towns and cities to ensure that the staged assaults could unfold without alerting the actual Polish military. Heydrich therefore brought in SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Emanuel Schäfer to help survey the German-Polish border. Schäfer was the Gestapo chief in the city of Oppoln, and he was an old friend of Heydrich's. But above all, he was a native Silesian with detailed knowledge of the region. On the 10th of August, Schäfer led Heydrich on a full reconnaissance of the border, identifying 2 suitable locations. The first site was the German customs office located close to the border near the small town of Hochlinden. Today, Hochlinden is known by the Polish name of Stodoly, and it's a suburb of the Polish town of Rybnik. The customs office was far from any residential areas, meaning there would be little chance of German civilians getting in the way. Plus, the nearby German-Polish border ran in such a way that a narrow wedge of German territory actually extended into Poland. Heydrich quickly realized that if a group of SS and SD men advanced into that narrow strip, then from there they could simply fire back towards the customs office, thus creating the deception that the gunfire was coming from Poland itself. To ensure that the false flag attack was spectacular enough, a separate group of men would then be ordered to defend the customs office, thus giving the illusion of a pitched battle between Polish attackers and German defenders. The second location chosen by Heydrich was a forestry station located near the town of Pitschen. Pitschen is today known as Byczyna in Polish, and in 1939 the forestry station sat at the edge of the Schlüsselwald forest, close to the Prosna River, and the river formed part of the German-Polish border. The forestry station was another perfect target for the operation, as it was located in a quiet, isolated setting, meaning there would be no one around to disturb any staged attack. Heydrich quickly drew up a plan. Here at Pitschen, a small force, dressed up as Polish insurgents, could march through the woods under cover, emerge from the trees, fire some shots at the forestry station, leave behind some staged evidence, and then slip back into the woods without being seen. However, whilst the remoteness of the customs office at Hochlinden and the forestry station at Pitschen made them ideal targets, Heydrich was concerned they weren't high-profile enough. So a third target was added to the operation: the prominent radio station in the town of Gleiwitz. Gleiwitz, known today by its Polish name of Gliwice, was, in 1939, located just 5 kilometers from the German-Polish border. The radio tower at Gleiwitz was 118 meters high, so it was a significant landmark in the area. And the fact that it was located so close to the border with Poland made it the ideal high-profile target Heydrich was looking for. The plan for Gleiwitz was smaller in scale, but still ambitious. Here, a group of SD men posing as Polish insurgents would assault the radio station complex, occupy the studio, and then broadcast a message in Polish calling for an insurrection against Germany. This incendiary broadcast was to be the jewel in the crown of the entire false flag operation, and subsequently the Gleiwitz Incident, as it came to be known, would become the most famous of the actions which took place, overshadowing the events at Pitschen and Hochlinden. With the locations for the false flag operation settled, Heydrich now appointed the commanders for each individual action. For the Hochlinden assault, Otto Hellwig was given command of the group of SS and SD men who would pose as the Polish attackers, whilst Hans Trümmler was ordered to lead the German defenders. The command of the assault on the forestry station at Pitschen, meanwhile, was given to Otto Rasch. And due to the importance of the attack at Gleiwitz, Heydrich appointed SS Sturmbannführer Alfred Naujoks, who was a trusted SD sabotage specialist, to lead this action. Naujoks was summoned by Heydrich on the 10th of August, and he was briefed on his mission. He was ordered to assemble a small team of operatives and take them to Gleiwitz. Crucially, his team must also have one Polish speaker tasked with delivering the broadcast. Within 2 days, Naujoks had assembled his men in Gleiwitz, and the team booked rooms in a local hotel, keeping a low profile. Naujoks ordered his men to conceal their SS, SD, and even German identities from the local population. Overall coordination of the 3 actions was to be overseen by Herbert Mehlhorn, who was to be stationed at the Gestapo headquarters in the city of Oppoln. Here, coded telephone signals would be sent from Berlin, triggering each phase of the operation. The actions at Hochlinden and Pitschen used 3 code words. The first was kleiner Auerhahn, which means little grouse, and this was the signal to prepare. The second was großer Auerhahn, which means big grouse, and this signaled that the teams should move into position. And the final code word was Agatha, which signaled that the attack should begin. The attack at Gleiwitz used a much simpler code word. Großmutter gestorben. Grandmother died. Whilst Alfred Neujok's team waited in Gleiwitz ahead of their assault, the hundreds of SS and SD men who had been chosen for the missions in Hochlinden and Pitschen were transported to an SD training school in the town of Bernau, 25 kilometers northeast of Berlin. The school was directed by SS Sturmbannführer Karl Hoffmann, who was Heydrich's former fencing instructor. By mid-August, around 360 men had arrived at the school. Upon arrival, they were required to hand over all personal belongings and swear oaths of secrecy, violations of which were punishable by death. Over the next few weeks, the men trained intensively. Polish army uniforms were issued to those who would pose as enemy infantry, whilst the rest of the men received Polish civilian clothing so that they could pass themselves off as partisans. The attention to detail was truly astonishing, with all recruits issued Polish cigarettes, personal letters, money, and rifles, all of which were to be carried by the recruits during their staged assaults. To complete the deception, the men were also given Polish-style haircuts, whilst several of the officers and NCOs grew beards and moustaches, as they were commonplace in the Polish army. Several of the recruits had actually served in the Polish army, so these men led the training and drill exercises. And every evening, all of the recruits rehearsed Polish marching songs, which they were expected to sing during their assaults. The men soon formed a tight-knit group, and one evening, during a boozy knees-up in the canteen, Otto Helwig asked the school director, Hoffmann, if he would like to join the operation. Hoffmann jumped at the chance and said yes. Meanwhile, Heydrich was finalizing the details for the operation, along with Heinrich Müller from the Gestapo, and both men were concerned that the false flag attacks would not be seen as genuine military assaults unless there were Polish casualties during the attacks. So to inject more authenticity, Müller arranged for dead bodies to be placed around the 3 attack sites. These bodies would be dressed up in Polish clothing to help sell the story that they were Polish soldiers or partisans who had been killed by defending German troops during the assaults. But where would these bodies come from? Unsurprisingly, given that we're talking about the Nazis, the solution was simple yet horrific. Heydrich and Müller decided that concentration camp inmates would provide the perfect resource. So prisoners from Sachsenhausen concentration camp to the north of Berlin were taken out of the camp and transported to Gestapo holding cells in the Silesian city of Breslau. The plan was to hold the prisoners in captivity until they were needed. Then, in the hours before the false flag operation began, they would be heavily sedated and then transported to each attack site. Once they arrived, these semi-conscious prisoners were to be dressed in Polish clothing before being shot by the Gestapo. In a cruel example of Nazi gallows humour, when these prisoners were transferred out of Sachsenhausen, they were issued with registry cards which read Aktion Konserven, which, in English, translates as Action Canned Goods. On the 22nd of August, Hitler invited his most senior generals to his mountaintop retreat at the Obersalzberg. Here, they finalized their plans for Fall Weiß, or Case White, the invasion of Poland. During this meeting, Hitler revealed to his generals that the SS was planning to execute a series of false flag attacks along the German-Polish border on the eve of the invasion. To put his generals' minds at ease regarding the morality of these false flag attacks, Hitler simply declared, "The winner is not asked later whether he said the truth or not." The next day, on the afternoon of the 23rd of August, Hitler formally issued the order for Fall Weiß, with the invasion of Poland scheduled to commence at 4:30 a.m. on the morning of the 26th. Immediately, Heydrich contacted Naujocks at Gleiwitz and Helwig, Trümmler, Rasch, and Hoffmann at Bernau, alerting them that the false flag operation should begin. At 5 a.m. the next morning, on the 24th of August, the roughly 360 recruits stationed at the school in Bernau piled into waiting trucks and set off in the direction of the German-Polish border. The men were under strict orders not to even look outside of the truck they were traveling in, let alone speak with any outsiders. The column of trucks drove 450 kilometers to the city of Oppoln, where they split up. The group commanded by Otto Rasch, which consisted of around 130 men, continued 60 kilometers northeast towards their target of the forestry station at Pitschen. They settled into a local guest house, which was then sealed off, with no one being allowed in or out. Meanwhile, Otto Helwich's group, which totaled around 220 men, drove 45 kilometers southeast to Ehrenforst, a small town located 30 kilometers from their target of the customs office at Hochlinden. The men were billeted in a local tavern, whilst the officers stayed at a nearby castle called Schloss Ehrenforst. Shortly after, Hans Trümmler also arrived with his group of men, who were to act as the heroic German defenders in the customs office attack. On the 25th of August, an order was issued to regular Wehrmacht units instructing them to pull back from the areas around Hochlinden and Pitschen. This was done to ensure that there wouldn't be any unfortunate friendly fire incidents once the false flag attacks got underway. And shortly after midday on the 25th, the commanders leading the three separate actions received sealed envelopes delivered by motorcycle messengers, who delivered the code word Kleine Auerhahn, which was the signal to prepare. Herbert Mehlhorn, who was in overall command of the false flag operation on the ground, moved to the police headquarters in Gleiwitz to await further orders from Berlin. By the evening, the commanders in charge of each false flag assault had received the second code word, großer Auerhahn, signaling that the various teams should start moving into position around their targets at Gleiwitz, Pitschen, and Hochlinden. The task force assigned to the Hochlinden assault set off, and they reached the customs office in the dead of night. On arrival, Helvich's men changed into their Polish uniforms and headed into the surrounding woods. Meanwhile, Trumler's detachment took up positions around the customs office, preparing for the expected attack. As both groups settled into place, they noticed a line of blacked-out Mercedes cars parked nearby. Some speculated that senior Nazi officials, perhaps even the Führer himself, had arrived to observe the operation in person. In reality, the vehicles belonged to the Gestapo, and they in fact contained drugged concentration camp prisoners, the so-called canned goods. With everything seemingly ready, Helvig gave the order for his men to begin their assault. However, what the men did not know was that the operation had, in fact, been postponed. At 8:30 that evening, Hitler decided to call off the invasion of Poland in response to two diplomatic bombshells. Firstly, Britain had reaffirmed its military support for Poland by signing a new mutual defence agreement. And secondly, Mussolini had informed Hitler that Italy was in no position to support a wider European war, its armed forces having been badly weakened by campaigns in Ethiopia and Spain. These developments made Hitler pause, and he issued an urgent order to all Wehrmacht units along the German-Polish border to stand down. As a result, Berlin quickly sent instructions to Herbert Mehlhorn in Gleiwitz to cancel the false flag attacks. Alfred Naujok's team in Gleiwitz and Otto Rasch's group in Pitschen were both contacted and stood down. Reaching the Hochlinden assault teams, however, proved far more difficult, particularly because Otto Helvich's men were deep in the woods, well beyond the reach of any telephone. Back in Berlin, Heydrich was coordinating the stand-down when reports arrived that Helvich's team had already taken up their positions and were, in fact, just moments away from attacking the Hochlinden customs office. And on hearing this, Heydrich went ballistic. Fearing that one of his teams was about to start World War II without Hitler's express permission, Heydrich urgently telegraphed Mehlhorn in Gleiwitz, ordering him to send a messenger to find Helvich's group in the forest and stop them from launching their attack. In theory, Helvig should not have been moments away from launching his assault, because the final code word ordering an attack, Agatha, had not been issued. It seems that Helvig confused the code word of großer Auerhahn with Agatha. Herbert Mehlhorn quickly dispatched another motorcycle messenger, and the messenger, in full German uniform, threw all caution to the wind as he raced across open fields to find Helvig's assault team. He eventually found the group, but by that point some of the men had mistakenly wandered off course and were 200 meters inside Polish territory. Luckily for Helvig, the order to call off the attack reached him before his team fired any shots, and he immediately withdrew his men, who all silently retreated back across the border into Germany. But there was more farce to come, because Helvig was apparently still confused by what was going on, and he ordered his men to prepare themselves for battle against real Polish troops who he believed would be advancing upon them at any moment. Appalled, Maelhorn sent the messenger back to Helvig, ordering him to hold off from starting any firefights and to immediately evacuate the area. Trumler and Helvig's men returned to Ehrenforst, whilst the blacked-out Gestapo cars containing the concentration camp inmates withdrew. Disaster had just about been avoided at Hochlinden, and the war would not start tonight. An investigation was immediately launched into the events, and Heydrich summoned the involved commanders to his office in Berlin, where he subjected them to a vicious tirade. Heydrich swiftly replaced Maelhorn as the overall commander of the operation, with Heinrich Müller from the Gestapo taking his place, whilst Otto Helvig was replaced as commander of the Hochlinden operation by Trumler. The leadership of Helvig's Polish group, meanwhile, was reassigned to SS Sturmbannführer Karl Hoffmann from the SD training school in Bernau. Another consequence of the botched assault at Hochlinden was that the plan for this particular action was revised and scaled down. Instead of hundreds of men being utilized in a mass simulated assault, it was decided that for the next time only 60 men would pose as Polish fighters. And to make sure that nobody wandered into Poland by mistake, the staged assault would be launched from well within German territory. With the Hochlinden action now rendered essentially toothless in terms of scale and propaganda impact, the assault on the radio station at Gleiwitz now took on even more importance. As a result, Heinrich Müller travelled to Gleiwitz and he met with Alfred Naujoks. Müller emphasized that a disguised corpse must be left at the scene, and for the maximum propaganda impact to be achieved, he argued that the corpse should belong to a prominent individual, someone who was well known in the local area for being a pro-Polish sympathizer. A search of Gestapo case files yielded a 41-year-old man called Franz Honiok, who, despite being an ethnic German, had fought alongside Polish nationalists in the 1921 Upper Silesian Rebellion. As Franz Honiok was strongly sympathetic to the Polish cause, this made him the ideal victim for Müller's plan. Gestapo agents swooped in to arrest Honiok, and he was placed in a holding cell at the Gleiwitz police headquarters on the 31st of August. Honiok, unaware of what was going to happen to him, awaited his fate. With the perfect victim now found, the attack on the Gleiwitz radio station was scheduled for 8 p.m. on the 31st of August. And Müller promised that the delivery of canned goods would arrive at the station between 8 p.m. and 10 past 8. The diplomatic events on the 26th of August had only delayed the inevitable. Therefore, shortly before 1 p.m. on the 31st of August, Hitler gave his final approval for the invasion of Poland. Fall Weiss was now rescheduled to begin at 5:45 a.m. on the 1st of September. With the invasion of Poland now only hours away, the false flag attacks were back on. At 4 p.m. on the 31st of August, Alfred Naujoks received a phone call from Heydrich, instructing him to call back. Naujoks returned the call, and when the line connected, he heard the code word, Großmutter gestorben, grandmother died, signaling that his attack on the radio station at Gleiwitz should begin. Heydrich also contacted the local police commander in Gleiwitz, ordering him to withdraw all of his officers who were guarding the radio station. They were instead replaced by a smaller group of Sicherheitspolizeimen who knew all about Naujox's impending assault. Their role was to ensure that Naujox's team could complete their mission undisturbed. At 8 p.m., 2 black saloon cars quietly pulled up to the front of the radio station. 7 men, dressed in Polish civilian clothing and armed with an array of machine guns and sidearms, emerged from the vehicles. The complex was surrounded by an imposing 2-meter-high fence topped with barbed wire. But Naujox's team were able to enter the complex through a gate which had been conveniently unlocked for them. Naujox led the majority of his team into the complex, whilst 2 of his men were ordered to stand guard at the unlocked gate. Here they were to receive the delivery of canned goods. Naujox and his men quickly made their way to the building which contained the broadcasting studio. Inside the building, 3 radio station employees were on duty, blissfully unaware of what was about to unfold. They had also been joined that evening by a 4th man who turned out to be one of Heydrich's Sicherheitspolizei operatives who had been assigned to guard the station that night. Naujox's men burst into the main broadcasting building with their guns raised, shouting "Hände hoch!" The station employees were quickly secured, though in the chaos, one of the employees was roughed up by Naujox's men, who grabbed him and smashed his head against a wall, nearly killing him. The radio station personnel and the Sicherheitspolizei guard were tied up and dragged to the basement of the building. One of Naujox's men kept watch over them, whilst another guarded the entrance to the building. All that was left now was for Naujox's team to make their dramatic broadcast. However, the assault team then came across 2 unexpected and potentially catastrophic problems. They couldn't get a broadcast line working, and they couldn't find a microphone. Despite the intense planning for the operation, it seemed that one crucial detail had been overlooked. Namely, that Gleiwitz radio station was only a relay transmitter for Radio Breslau, and all it did was pass on the programming from Radio Breslau using the same frequency. In short, Gleiwitz couldn't even make its own broadcasts. One of the station employees was quickly brought up from the basement, and he confirmed that the only way the Gleiwitz tower could make external broadcasts was via a telephone exchange line located 4 kilometers away. Naujox's group frantically searched for a solution, and after persuading the station employee with a series of kicks and slaps, a workaround was found. It turns out that the station did have a microphone which could be used to make external broadcasts, issuing storm warnings to the local area. This was far from ideal, but with no other option, Naujox's team interrupted the regular broadcast from Breslau, and they set up the microphone. The assault team's designated Polish speaker grabbed the microphone and he delivered his prepared speech, which included the words, "Attention, here is Gleiwitz. The radio station is in Polish hands." For added dramatic effect, the rest of the men fired gunshots into the ceiling whilst the broadcast was being delivered, to give the impression that an intense, violent assault was taking place. Residents in the local area who were listening to the radio were shocked to hear their usual evening's programming interrupted by a broadcast apparently being made by Polish partisans. One of those listening was a woman called Frau Klause, who was actually the wife of the manager of the radio station. After hearing the drama unfold on her radio at home, she alerted her husband, who lived on the premises of the radio station. Herr Klause approached the transmitter building to see what was going on, but he hastily beat a retreat when an armed man, who was one of Naujoks's raiders, confronted him. Herr Klause ran away to alert the Gleiwitz police. Meanwhile, some Gestapo arrived, bringing with them their delivery of canned goods. By now, Franz Honiok had been injected with a concoction of heavy sedatives, and he was barely conscious. Unable to stand, Honiok was carried out of the car and he was laid down on the floor, just inside the side entrance of the main radio station building. With the canned goods now on site and the broadcast in Polish sent, Naujoks's men had completed their mission. In total, the assault had only lasted 17 minutes, and Naujoks's team quickly fled the scene before the authorities showed up. Naujoks later recalled that as he left the complex, he saw Honiok's now lifeless body lying on the floor. Honiok had been executed, and blood was pouring from a gunshot to his head. It's unknown who exactly was responsible for Honiok's murder, but his death wasn't just tragic. It was also highly significant, as Franz Honiok has gone down in history as perhaps being the first person to die in the Second World War. The assault team safely made their way back to their hotel, and Alfred Naujoks telephoned Heydrich back in Berlin to report on his mission. As soon as Heydrich picked up the phone, he started berating Naujoks, demanding to know why he had not heard the Polish broadcast. As far as Heydrich was concerned, he had tuned into the right frequency, but he had heard nothing. It soon dawned upon Naujoks that the decision to use the station's storm warning broadcast service had been utterly futile, because the range of this service was severely limited. As a result, no one beyond the immediate Gleiwitz area had heard the Polish broadcast. Brilliant. Back at the Gleiwitz radio station, local police arrived. Unfortunately for the local police, however, the Gestapo had already locked down the scene. The station's employees had been freed, but the local police units were denied access to the complex. An immediate order arrived at Gleiwitz Police Headquarters, informing them that the investigation into the assault was to be handled by the Gestapo alone, though a local police photographer was granted access so that he could photograph the scene. The Gestapo made sure that he took plenty of photographs of Franz Honiok's body. At 1 a.m., another order came through, demanding that the photographer hand over all finished and unfinished negatives to the Gestapo. The material was rushed to the Gleiwitz airfield, where Heinrich Müller was waiting impatiently, his aircraft engines already running. Müller then flew straight to Berlin with the photos. The photos were supposed to form a core part of the Nazis' propaganda about the radio station assault. Yet it was determined that the first batch of photos weren't inflammatory enough. So in the following days, Müller dispatched a second photographer. But when this photographer arrived, the scene had changed completely. By now, Franz Honiok's body had been dragged into the radio station's control room, leaving bloody smears along the way. Plus, a second dead body had also been placed in the control room. The identity of this second corpse remains a mystery, though it was likely another concentration camp inmate brought in after Naujoks's team had completed their assault. The subsequent investigation, if it can really be called that, unsurprisingly came to the conclusion that the Gleiwitz radio station had been the victim of a vicious attack from Polish insurgents. Whilst Naujoks and his team carried out their assault at Gleiwitz, SS Oberfuhrer Otto Rasch, leading a group of 130 SS and SD men, launched his staged attack on the forestry station at Pitschen. At 8 p.m., the Agata code signal for the Pitschen assault was given, and Rasch's task force, clad in Polish partisan uniforms, left the tavern where they had been staying and proceeded towards the forestry station. The task force felt relaxed, and Rasch expected his men to be back at the tavern by around 10 p.m. The group drove to an assembly position 3 kilometers away from the forestry station, and from there they marched towards their target on foot. Whilst marching, the men spared no expense in trying to pass themselves off as genuine Polish partisans, making sure to speak Polish with each other whilst also singing Polish marching songs at the top of their lungs. When the men reached the forestry station, they immediately began firing shots into the air. Some of the group broke into the house, smashed up the kitchen, and poured half a bucket of ox blood around to make it look as if a bloody engagement had taken place. The forester who usually occupied the house was in on the false flag operation, and he played his part by calling the local mayor to report that his forestry station was being attacked by Polish fighters. Rasch's task force didn't have any canned goods to leave behind. However, they did go to the effort of digging a fake grave nearby to suggest that a fallen fighter had been buried. A short while later, German border guards who had been alerted by the local mayor arrived at the scene. But they found the place abandoned, with all of the supposed Polish intruders long since gone. Rasch and his men arrived back at the local tavern at 10 p.m, as planned. They duly celebrated their victory with copious amounts of tea and rum, jokingly mourning the loss of their comrade who supposedly had been buried in the fake grave. Whilst the Gleiwitz and Pitschen assaults took place in the evening of the 31st of August, the assault on the German customs office at Hochlinden was scheduled for 4 a.m. on the 1st of September. Now, given the botched assault on the evening of the 26th, the Hochlinden action had been scaled back, and now only 60 men, commanded by Karl Hoffmann, would assault the customs office posing as Polish attackers. Hans Trümmler, meanwhile, would still command the separate group of German defenders. Both groups received the Agata code signal at 8 p.m. on the 31st of August, which gave them ample time to prepare for the assault, with Hoffmann's group quickly changing into their Polish disguises. At 11 p.m., trucks transported Hoffmann and Trümmler's men to the Hochlinden customs office, where they arrived shortly before midnight. As the men disembarked from their trucks, they once again saw a series of blacked-out cars, which contained the drugged-up concentration camp inmates. Hoffmann's force took up their position roughly 100 meters from the customs office, making sure to stay firmly on the German side of the border. Meanwhile, Trümmler's group of German defenders positioned themselves just to the north of the building. At precisely 4 a.m., Hoffmann fired several pistol shots, signaling the start of the assault. Hoffmann's men dramatically charged the building, firing shots into the air and shouting insults, curses, and commands in Polish. Trümmler's German defenders returned fire, making sure, of course, to aim well above the heads of the attackers to avoid any friendly fire incidents. The supposed Polish raiders shot at the windows of the building, and they peppered the facade with hundreds of rounds. Hoffmann ordered his men to also break down the door and smash up the inside of the building with their rifle butts. But his men hesitated to do this as they were afraid of destroying German state property. To put the men at ease, Hoffmann and his NCOs personally led the destruction efforts themselves, smashing everything they could. The rest of the men quickly joined in. Once enough damage had been caused, Trümmler's German force moved in and captured the Polish attackers, ending the assault. The prisoners were then quickly loaded back onto their trucks and transported back to their base at Ehrenforst. In all of the commotion of the staged battle, no one had noticed Gestapo men discreetly planting the bodies of 6 murdered concentration camp prisoners around the scene. The victims, drugged into unconsciousness, had been executed with shots to the head, chest, and back. Crucially, they had also been dressed in Polish uniforms. Just as at the Gleiwitz radio station, photographs were immediately taken of the bodies, and these photos were sent to Berlin. The bodies were then loaded onto a closed truck and removed from the scene. They were later secretly buried in unmarked graves in a nearby forest, though the exact location is no longer known. And with this last action, the false flag operation was over. The false flag attacks were immediately seized upon by German state media to fabricate the narrative that Poland had attacked Germany. And, as had been planned all along, these Polish incursions across the border were used to justify Germany's decision to launch Fall Weiss. As early as 10:30 p.m. on the 31st of August, German state radio was already broadcasting the first reports of incidents along the border, including an alleged armed Polish takeover of the Gleiwitz radio station. In the hours to come, further reports detailed other Polish attacks taking place at Pitschen and Hochlinden. And to ensure the incidents reached a global audience, the German state news agency circulated reports of these Polish attacks to every international news bureau based in Berlin. This tactic was successful, as the BBC soon reported on an alleged Polish attack at the Gleiwitz radio station, with several Poles also apparently being killed. The next day, the New York Times also reported on the supposed Polish assault at Gleiwitz, whilst also mentioning further attacks at Pitschen and Hochlinden. At 10 a.m. on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler addressed a special session of the Reichstag, held at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. In his speech, he said, "This night, for the first time, Polish regular soldiers fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m., we have been returning the fire, and from now on, bombs will be met by bombs. I will continue this struggle, no matter against whom, until the safety of the Reich and its rights are secured." With this declaration, the Second World War had begun. Despite the importance the Nazis attached to the false flag operation, the attacks were plagued by a litany of mistakes and poor planning, which ultimately means their impact was limited at best. Yes, meticulous attention to detail was invested into certain aspects of the operation, such as the use of authentic Polish military clothing and weaponry. And the soldiers who undertook the assaults on the ground did carry out their assignments reasonably well. But these bright spots do not hide the fact that the attacks promised much, but delivered little. Firstly, during the attack on the customs office at Hochlinden, only a few villagers living nearby even heard the firefight. And yet, none of these villagers reported seeing any Polish insurgents. The assault on the forestry station at Pitschen, meanwhile, received even less notice from locals, thanks to the remote location of the building at the edge of a forest. And lastly, the supposed Polish takeover of the radio station at Gleiwitz, which had been hyped up as the single most important false flag attack, also fell flat, because the most incendiary part of the assault, the broadcast of the Polish insurrection, only reached the local people of Gleiwitz. No one else in Germany, let alone the world, had even heard the broadcast. But even if the Gleiwitz raid wasn't as spectacular as planned, that didn't stop Heydrich from installing a scale model of the Gleiwitz radio station in his office. And the model was even complete with lights and sound effects. Apparently, he often used the model to regale foreign diplomats with stories about the Gleiwitz assault, proudly stating to them that this is where the war began. Nevertheless, flashing scale models aside, nothing can obscure the truth that the false flag attacks failed in their key objective of convincing the world that Poland had attacked Germany first. Britain and France were not swayed by the false flag operation, and once Hitler launched his full-scale invasion of Poland, this was swiftly followed by a declaration of war on Germany by the Western Allies. As a result, Hitler's dream of avoiding war with Britain and France for as long as possible now lay in tatters. And he knew that as soon as Poland was defeated, the German military machine would have to gear itself up for a potentially long and destructive conflict with the West. Perhaps in recognition of the failure of the false flag operation, the photographs which were taken of the planted bodies at the Gleiwitz and Hochlinden raids were never published or used in any Nazi propaganda. It's reported that the photographs disappeared and were never seen again. No trace was ever found of Franz Honiok's body either. In Honiok's hometown, rumors quickly spread that he had participated in the assault on the Gleiwitz radio station. However, his family, who were rightly afraid of suffering at the hands of the Gestapo themselves, chose to not even report to the authorities that Honiok was missing. After the false flag operation was over, the men who took part in the Hochlinden and Pitschen assaults were transported back to their training school in Bernau, northeast of Berlin. Here, they were forced to make another pledge of secrecy, and then they were dismissed. Apparently, some discussions took place in Berlin whether all of the men involved in the false flag attacks should be sent to concentration camps and killed to ensure that they really did take their secret to the grave. But Karl Hoffmann prevented this, threatening to escalate the matter to Heydrich if it went any further. Most of what we know about the false flag operation comes from detailed accounts given by some of the men who were responsible for planning and executing the attacks. For example, in 1944, Alfred Naujoks, the commander of the Gleiwitz raid, surrendered to US forces. Subsequently, an affidavit from Naujoks was used at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, in which the true nature of the Gleiwitz assault was revealed to the world. In 1960, Naujoks published a book about his experiences, co-written with the author Günther Pries, and the book had the suitably bombastic title of The Man Who Started the War. Moreover, Herbert Mehlhorn, the initial commander of the false flag operation, gave a detailed interview about the operation to the German magazine Stern in 1952. And lastly, Otto Hellwig, who led the Polish attackers during the first Hochlinden raid, also provided key details in an article which was published in the German magazine Spiegel in 1979. All three false flag locations now lie well within the territory of modern-day Poland. The former customs office at Hochlinden still stands, though it is now a residential house. Nothing remains of the forestry station in Pitschen, however, as the building was completely destroyed in a fire after the war. In the town of Gleiwitz, now known as Gleiwitz, the former radio station is now a museum. The wooden radio tower is still there, and the tower still holds the record for being the tallest freestanding wooden structure in Europe. To set the record straight, Polish authorities have installed a plaque at the entrance to the site, stating that on the 31st of August 1939, this was the location of a Nazi provocation, not a Polish one. I'm David Sumner, and that was the story of the false flag attacks which took place along the German-Polish border on the eve of the Second World War. Merry Christmas to you all, or, as they say here in Germany, Frohe Weihnachten.